Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to be here with you tonight. I've been looking forward to this for a very long time, to be with two of my friends, two of the greatest minds that we have in our country today. We're very fortunate. Such an incredible group. We love you. I think I know almost everyone in this room. If I don't, I apologize. We should get to know each other, but thank you for the good work that you're doing for our state and for our country. Tonight will be a success. The less I talk and the more we get to hear from these gentlemen. I do just want to, by way of introduction, share just a couple thoughts on both of them. I've had an opportunity to share the stage with both of them on multiple occasions. I truly mean it. I honestly feel tonight like I get to sit here and you all get to listen to modern day James Madison and a modern day learned hand. I feel that way about both of these men. They are so well respected, and we're going to talk a lot about Yuval's newest book. If you have not read it, shame on you. You should. Please do. It's called American Covenant. It's about the Constitution. I think it's the most important book written on the Constitution in a long time, and it's one, I don't know if you know this, Yuval, but I sent a copy to every member of the legislature 2 weeks ago, a signed copy by me, not that I wrote it, but I left a note in there for them, and I also sent a copy to every governor in America when it first came out. That's how strongly I feel about it. But someone tweeted out what I think was a little bit of a backhanded compliment about Yuval, and I want to share it with you because it's how I feel about both Judge Griffith and Yuval. This person said this: "My major problem with Yuval Levin is that he not only says everything I think so much better than I can say it, but he also has the temerity to routinely say things brilliantly that I would have also believed if I was smart enough to have thought them first." That's how I feel about both of these gentlemen, and I'm excited to have a conversation with them tonight. So let's jump right in. Yuval, I do want to just start by talking about the book. You'd written a book previously to this, and you spoke at BYU today about a time to build. You're in a room full of builders, and that's important. And then I felt like this was the perfect follow-up. It tells us how to build. Can you just talk about why you chose this Constitution? I'll let you share the subtitle because I think it's really important about how the Constitution can save us. But give them a little background, please.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and thanks to all of you for being here. The opportunity for me, first of all, to be with my favorite governor in America, and really, I mean that, a person who exemplifies what leadership can look like in a moment like this, and I appreciate that. And Judge Griffith is just a brilliant man who I always learn from, and the idea of being in their company, though I am not in their league, is an extraordinary thing for me. This book, for me, came out of a number of years of working on the question of the condition of American institutions, the question of how the social crisis that our society is living through is rooted in a crisis of institutional failure and of loss of trust in institutions. I tried to think through what are institutions in American life? Why do they matter? What does it mean to trust and to lose trust in them? And the more that I thought about it, especially in connection with the everyday work that I do, which is really in the public policy world, the more it seemed to me that a lot of us in America could use a kind of reintroduction to the Constitution, a way of understanding it not just as a legal document, though it is that, and not as a tool of judges and lawyers, but as a framework for national cohesion in our diverse society. I think that in some ways, first and foremost, that is what the Constitution is. When it rises to explain its purpose, the first thing it says is that it's there to help us form a more perfect union. And in thinking about what it does for us, it seems to me that it points us in the direction of an idea of unity that is achievable in a diverse society, as ours has always been. An idea of unity that says unity in a free society doesn't mean thinking alike, but acting together. It doesn't require us to all agree about everything. It requires us to find ways to solve common problems by working through disagreement. And there's no message that we need to hear more in contemporary America than that we have this framework available to us, and that if we recur to the Constitution, we can find ways to act together on common problems, even when we don't all think alike. I think that a reintroduction to the Constitution that begins from that place is useful not only as a civics tool, as a way to teach the rising generation, but even for those of us who think a lot about the Constitution, who really think we know it, to encounter it this way, from this angle, might be a way for us to understand what's missing now, what exactly is wrong and needs to be fixed. And so that's what the book offers. It's an introduction to the various institutions of our system, to the logic of our system, all through the framework of how it thinks about helping a divided society hold together and solve its problems.
Thank you. Judge Griffith, you've written and spoken often about the Constitution as a judge coming from a different branch of government than myself. Yuval writes that the Constitution united our nation before, and it can do it again. You've written a lot about civic virtue and the role that each of us plays in trying to make that happen. Can you share with us your perspective from the bench on how you see the Constitution as this living force to help bring us together?
I'd be happy. I'd be happy to, but let me begin by saying what an honor it is to be with Governor Cox again, who inspires me with his Disagree Better initiative, and we're still working on things there. And I've long been a fan, even an acolyte of Yuval Levin. But if I can tell a personal story, where I got to the place I am now is in large measure due to President Dallin Oaks. And here's the story. I can't remember when it was. I want to say it was 2014, 2015, something like that. I'm in my chambers, and I get a phone call from one of my colleagues, Judge David Tatel, who's by all measures one of the great judges in American history. And he had been a student of President Oaks at the University of Chicago. And he said, "Tom, have you seen today's New York Times?" And I said, "No, I haven't." He said, "Well, there's an article in there about Elder Oaks gave a speech in California to a group. You ought to look at it." I remember looking at it, and I can't quote it verbatim, but here's the message that I got from it. We are not culture warriors. We're not at war with our fellow citizens. We're looking for ways to accommodate one another to the best that we can, And I remember reading that, and I was struck, because I thought, oh, no, actually, Griffith, you're a culture warrior. That's sort of how I had identified myself politically through the years, and it began to dawn on me that that's probably not the right way to be. And so that's when I began a journey of reading into folks who had this better view of the Constitution. I read a book by then Professor Matthew Holland. It was his PhD dissertation at Duke that was published by Georgetown University Press. And it was called Bonds of Affection, Civic Charity and the Making of America. And in that, then Professor, now Elder Holland, traces the idea that he called civic charity from the earliest days of our country, from the founding America, from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. There's always been this idea that we are about bonds of affection. That's a critical part of us. Obviously, the greatest expression of that is from our greatest president, with Abraham Lincoln and his inaugural address. You know, the passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. We are not enemies, but friends. The combination of reading those things, I had a paradigm shift and realized, no, that, as Yuval points out, I had always, if you had asked me before then, what's the Constitution about? And I asked this of my students, reflexively they answer, rights. It's about my rights. It's about freedom of speech. It's about freedom of religion. It's about equal protection. And it is. It's about all of those things, and those are critically important. But it's about there's something antecedent to that I think is even more important, and it's what Yuval's written about and what President Oaks has talked about, and that is the Constitution creates a form of interacting with others in government. And it's a form that you need to treat others with dignity and respect. You need to listen to them. You need to come to the bargaining table and negotiate with them. And the process by which you reach the result is every bit as important as the result. The Constitution is not just about good results. It's about a process that leads to the results. And if you bypass the process, you're not doing the Constitution. So now, what does that have to do with being a judge? For 15 years, I sat on the D.C. Circuit, and I got to see wonderful people appointed by different presidents of different parties model that very form of decision-making, trying to come up with the best answer in a collegial manner. I wish that everyone could see what I saw in my 15 years on the D.C. Circuit. People with vastly different viewpoints about things, and yet a boundless respect and admiration for one another, even though you thought they wrote just a really awful opinion, right? There was no questioning their good faith. You just disagreed about their interpretation of the law, and yet you had respect for them. And that inspires me. That's a model that I wish the political branches would follow. And if they read Yuval's book, and as you read it, they will. That's the way our government is supposed to work. So,
thank you. And I can say that Judge Griffith models that. I also have to say that for our NGA convening in February of last year with Disagree Better, he had the ability to bring 2 Supreme Court justices to speak to us to model that very behavior. We had Justice Sotomayor and Justice Barrett come together, and it's on YouTube. If you haven't watched it, I would encourage you to go watch it. I wish everybody in America could watch it, because all we hear is about how terrible the Supreme Court is and how divided they are, and then you see these two, again, ideologically very divided people on stage modeling this behavior, talking about how much they love and respect each other, and how they work together. It's a beautiful thing. Thank you.
And as I recall, there were 41 governors there that day.
That's correct, yeah.
And am I overstating it? The justices got a thunderous standing ovation.
You are not overstating.
It was like, a spaceship from Venus had landed. They had never seen anything like this before, and so
it was incredible, really incredible. Okay, I kind of want to go where the conversation's leading us, and so Yuval, because he brought it up, I want to talk about kind of the formative role of the Constitution. You write about this often. Traditionally, I do think we think of the Constitution as law, and it is law. But you make the case that the Constitution, the design of the Constitution is more than that. It actually, we formed the Constitution, and then the Constitution forms us. Can you talk about what that means and why that's important?
Yeah, I mean, the American people, the American character is shaped by our Constitution in a way that's very distinct and very unusual, even in the democratic world. We've lived under this Constitution for a long time, for the vast majority of our time as a nation. And there's a way in which it has come to be a part of us where a number of years back, I heard my son and a few of his friends having an argument. One of them says, well, I've got free speech. I can say what I want. And I thought, this kid has been formed somehow to think of himself as an American with basic constitutional rights. But there's more than that. We are ultimately formed by practice, by habits. Our virtues are formed by habits, and that means that the things we do habitually are the things that become who we are. And that means that those procedures that Judge Griffith is talking about enter into our self-understanding, enter into our personality, enter into our character as a nation, because they are how we do things. You often hear people saying, empty proceduralism, right? That if you worry too much about process and not outcome, you're avoiding the moral content. You're being neutral about the outcome. I think that's exactly wrong. There's actually nothing less neutral than process and procedure. It is literally how you shape your own moral formation. It is literally how we shape one another. The process by which we do things is how we come to understand the people with whom we do those things. The ways in which we are constrained define how we think about other people. If we believe that other people have the same kind of dignity we have, the same kind of right to be heard, the same kind of right to practice their religion, ultimately, we unavoidably come to think of those people as possessed of human dignity, as deserving respect. And that is not just a function of starting from principle. That's a function of living with the practice of treating people as if they are our equals, because they are. And that practice is enormously important. We can state these principles all we want, but if we don't live them, then we don't really believe them. And living them is what these kinds of procedures and practices that are enshrined and required in the Constitution ultimately enable us to do. They shape us fundamentally. They shape us profoundly. They form how we think about one another. And in a society that is as diverse as ours, where not everybody shares our views, not everybody comes from where we come from, the idea that the ways in which we engage with each other are mediated by these forms that insist on equal justice under law, that insist on a set of rights and principles that define the ways in which we can exercise power over each other, that constrain majorities, that constrain powerful people, that constrain people with authority over us. That's enormously important for living in a free society. It's how we become the kind of people who can be trusted with the kind of responsibility that an American citizen has. American citizen is not a natural artifact. Americans don't fall from trees. They're made. They're produced by the very process of living in a free society that makes it obvious to them every day that we take these principles seriously.
Can I say
Please,
amen to
jump in.
that?
Yeah.
Double that. I couldn't agree more with that. And we all want to support and defend the Constitution, right? That's many of us have taken an oath to do that. If you've ever been held office or been in the military, and those who haven't, we want to support and defend the Constitution. And in Utah culture, there's a strong tradition that we have a special stewardship with regard to the Constitution, right? That we need to support and defend the Constitution. What Yuval and President Oaks have taught me, when I think of supporting and defending the Constitution, I want to whip out my pocket copy. Where is it? Got it. Oh, it's over here. Whip out my pocket copy of the Constitution and say, religious liberty. Yeah, I'm going to support and defend the Constitution for religious liberty. And that's true. I want to do that. To say, but if you want to support and defend the Constitution at its most fundamental level, you engage in this type of activity. You engage in activity where you are willing to bargain, negotiate, and compromise. It's that process. That's how I believe. That's how you support and defend the Constitution. And from my perspective, as a former judge, from my perspective, the greatest threat to the Constitution today, I don't see that greatest threat right now coming as a diminution of my liberties, right? I think my liberties are in pretty good shape. Religious liberties are in great shape with this court. Oh my gosh, it's great shape. Freedom of speech, yeah, it depends on which college campus you're on, but it's generally pretty good. To me, those aren't the greatest threats. The greatest threat, I believe, is the contempt that is existing, that's present in our political discourse today, because it prevents us from doing the type of activity that Yuval has pointed out the Constitution demands. The framers could have chosen any one of a number of systems of government to reach good ends, right? But they chose one that the process matters deeply. It's not just the results, it's the end. So if we want to support and defend the Constitution, the question we need to ask ourselves is am I doing this? Am I doing this? The best explanation of this that I've ever heard, and I'm going to sound like this is just all I pay on to President Oaks, but it is the following phrase, which he uttered at a general conference of the church a couple of years ago: on contested issues, we should seek to moderate and to unify. That, to me, that's the check. You want to know if you're supporting and defending the Constitution? Does that describe my last social media post? Does that describe my involvement in whatever debate it is? And if it doesn't, in my view, excuse me, I'm going to offend you here. You may think you're supporting and defending the Constitution. You're not. You're actually damaging it, you're hurting it, unless you engage, unless you have the insights that Yuval has offered. So.
Well, let me maybe say one more word about this. I very much agree with you. I think that it's worth seeing why this matters this much in thinking about the Constitution. I suggested before that I think there's an idea of unity implicit in the Constitution that says unity doesn't mean thinking alike but acting together. That's an idea of unity that invites an obvious question. And the question is, how? How are we supposed to act together when we don't think alike? The Constitution, in a lot of ways, is a set of answers to that question. And over, the answers look like negotiation, accommodation, bargaining. The reason we value that is because it is an answer, and ultimately maybe the only legitimate answer, to that basic question: how can we act together on common problems when we don't think alike? There are people in our society who think there's a simpler answer. The simpler answer is just pure majority rule, right? That's legitimate. Democracy is based on majority rule. The Constitution is too. But it's also based on understanding of the fact that majority rule can also be very dangerous, that simple majority rule threatens minorities and individuals, and that if even the narrowest majority can rule, then minorities in our society will always find themselves threatened. And so the Constitution doesn't just say simple majority rule. It says broad, durable majority rule. In order to actually do anything, you have to have more than just 50% plus one. You have to have a broad majority across different institutions, elected in different ways, accountable in different ways, over time. Otherwise, you can't do anything. It's why in this moment of such narrow majorities in our politics, everybody's very frustrated. They feel like they're constantly being restrained by the Constitution. But what the system is saying to them is, broaden your coalition, get more people on board, and then you can do it. It's not, let's just win bigger next time. That's not really going to quite work. It's talk to those other people. Don't come in with a little tiny majority and say, how are we going to do everything on our own? Come in and say, who can we bring on board, and what do we need to offer them so that we can do this together? Over and over, that's what the Constitution wants to say to us. And in 21st century America, we just don't listen to that enough. We want to find ways to get around it, to not do what the system demands that we do in response to difference and division. And it's only if we see that the way forward requires us to reach accommodations that broaden the coalitions we're part of that our system can work.
Thank you for sharing that piece, because that's one of the things I really wanted to talk about. Is you've talked often about how we all think that if we just win the next election, we'll never have to deal with those people, those other people, and the Constitution says no. You're always going to have to deal with those people, so deal with them, and we're not very good at that, especially with these narrow majorities. I do want to talk about ways in which it's the system and the Constitution are broken right now, and I want to get some perspectives from both the kind of the division of powers between the different branches of government, what's not working there. Yuval, you've written a lot, and you actually talked about it tonight, about Congress was intended, the framers intended Congress to be the most powerful branch of government. That was always the intention, and that has changed. We have the rise of the imperial presidency. The Supreme Court has become much more important than it was ever intended to be. Can you talk, and then Judge Griffith, I want your perspective as well, coming from the judicial branch. Can you talk about kind of why that happened, how it happened, and if there's anything we can do, what the end results of that are, and what can we do to try to change that?
Yeah, I think we have a tendency in thinking about the structure of our system now to talk in terms of co-equal branches. And the framers of the Constitution don't talk in terms of co-equal branches. They describe them as coordinate branches, but they always see that in a Republican form of government, the legislature is going to be preeminent. Now, that's not entirely good news, but it's a fact. And as they understand it, the legislature, because it's representative, because it's most directly connected to the people, is going to be the branch of government that sets the direction, sets the agenda.
I can say this really hurts my feelings, especially during a legislative session right now in our state, but carry on.
Yeah. But, if you look at the way the system is structured, Congress has the power of the purse. Congress can impeach and remove both judges and executive officials. And ultimately, Congress creates those durable legislative frameworks in which everybody else operates. Now, the president has a part in that process. The courts have a role over that process too. but Congress's role is central. And I would say in looking at the contemporary condition of the American constitutional system, the problem that sticks out is the weakness of Congress. We're going to spend a lot of time in the next 4 years talking about executive power and asking whether it's gone too far. Maybe we'll talk about judicial power and ask if it's gone too far. We need to spend more time talking about congressional power and asking whether it's not going far enough. Congress's weakness is a more important problem than presidential strength or judicial overreach, because Congress creates a vacuum which the other branches rush to fill. The fact that presidents would want a lot of power would not have surprised the framers of the Constitution. The fact that judges would want more power would not have surprised them. The fact that Congress seems not to want the power it could have would have surprised them. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that happening? It does seem as though there's a kind of willful dereliction here, an intentional self-weakening on the part of Congress. And I think a lot of it is a function of the nature of our political culture, where the division, where the separation of parties has replaced the separation of powers in some important ways, and members understand themselves as playing a part in a political drama in which the president is the star, and so don't really see themselves as setting the agenda, as creating the frameworks for the future. And ultimately, the kinds of incentives they confront, electoral incentives that are rooted in the primary system, which I think is just not a great fit for 21st century political culture, and institutional incentives, where power has been centralized in Congress, and a lot of members just don't really have a role to play in driving legislation. A lot of them are stuck. Look, they're ambitious men and women. These are serious people. And they're stuck in a place where the only way to really succeed and be prominent is to get a big social media following, or to get a prominent spot on cable news and be seen and heard by their constituents, their primary voters especially, mouthing the slogans of the moment. If that's how members understand what success looks like, that's what they're going to do. And so in thinking about reform of the system, we have particularly to think about reforms that could enable Congress to reclaim its central role. The big problem, it's often easy to see what we have too much of and hard to see what we have too little of. And so we talk about how we have too much presidential and judicial power. The core problem is that we have too little congressional power in this moment.
Judge Griffith, we've seen a court for the first time, and you've all mentioned this idea that the framers would see judges wanting more power and presidents wanting more power. That's where this balance was supposed to happen, where if everybody wants more power, it actually kind of works. We have a court now that is giving up some of that power and returning it to Congress, with overturning Chevron deference and some others saying, no, Congress, you actually have to do your jobs. But you got to see this happening over the course of your career, where you were forced to make more and more decisions because Congress wasn't. Can you just talk about that dysfunction and how it's impacting the courts? And I would also like you to, if you could, touch on our trust in these institutions, our trust in the institutions of the court. Courts are under attack, not just federal courts, but here in Utah as well. And I'd love to hear your perspective.
Sure. So I'm a supporter of the Roberts Court generally. These are my people, and Washington's a small town, and so, I know them.
I won't ask you to criticize any particular justice.
No, you won't. I mean, I have just opinion with some of them on certain things, but I think these are really good folks, and I also am generally in agreement with the direction of the Roberts Court. And to understand the Roberts Court, I believe you need to understand that the issue that I think they care about more than any is the separation of powers. That's not the type of thing that you get all excited about generally, but it is the most important feature of the Constitution. Many of them, all of them, were greatly influenced by Justice Scalia, and in his standard stump speech, which I heard him give 1,000 times, he would talk about, any banana republic has got a Bill of Rights. The Soviet Union's got a Bill of Rights. What good does it do them? He said, what's distinctive about our Constitution is the separation of powers. And this court, they all believe that. And so, so if you want to understand what they're trying to do, I think that's it. And so that's by way of prelude. They have signaled that that they think that Congress needs to do its job better. In a major decision last year, they finally put to death a line of cases that in which the courts had more power than they should. And they put that to death because that's a power that belongs to Congress. So they're very much in agreement, I think, with what we just heard from Yuval, trying to get Congress to do its job. This court has shown, in that vein, they've shown a particular interest in presidential power, I think you'll continue to see that in the series of challenges that will be coming to some of that are coming to President Trump's executive orders. I'm not good at, what was it that Yogi Berra reportedly said about predictions? I'm not very good about predictions, especially about the future. So I may not be, that's a laugh line, especially about the future. Okay. So I may be wrong on this prediction, but I think you're going to see the Supreme Court uphold many of the actions that President Trump has taken, particularly when it comes to personnel decisions, replacing people in the executive branch, because he's the head of the executive branch. I think you'll see them block some of his actions when it comes to spending, refusing to spend money that Congress has appropriated. I think you'll see that. But again, once again, what's going on here is they're carefully guarding what they think are the separation of powers. Now, from my personal perspective, for what it's worth, the only way a federal judge can supplement his or her salary is to write a book. That's too hard. Or to teach a class. That's a little easier. So when I first became a judge, I started teaching class at BYU's law school on presidential power. Frankly, it's not something that I knew a whole lot about, and I thought, given the court that I'm on, I probably ought to learn something about this. So I'm going to give you, Guido Sarducci's 5-Minute University. You remember that thing? He summarizes everything you learn in a university in 3 minutes. I'm going to give you Judge Griffith's version of everything you need to know about presidential power in the United States. We really want a king. Most people really want, not a king, that's too British sort of thing. But American people seem to want strong, vigorous action in the executive, and they just don't seem to get that excited about a Congress with all the tough work that goes into play in making laws. And I think, and this is going to sound a little strange, I think this court wants to give the executive all the power that it deserves, but I think they also recognize that there are real limits on that power, and they're trying to get Congress to do its job. Let's see if that works. I think it's a hard thing to get Congress to do their job, because all the members of Congress have benefited from this current arrangement of not doing a whole lot and still getting reelected. So.
Let me press a point there that I think is very important to Tom. I think that there's a way for us in thinking about the kinds of executive power questions we're going to be thinking about in the next 4 years. There's a kind of rule of thumb that I would offer you about how to distinguish these questions. And that is that the president does command the executive branch, but the executive branch doesn't command American government. And this Supreme Court is very insistent on both of those points, which seem at first like they might be contradictory, but are actually in the service of the very same correct, I think, constitutional vision. So if the question is, can the president fire that guy or let that idiot 21-year-old run the Treasury finance system, yeah, the president can probably do that. He is actually in charge of running the executive branch. But if the question is, can the president ignore Congress, or can the president shut down an agency created by law, the answer is probably no. And those two answers actually point in the same direction. They point toward the Constitution and its vision of separated but assertive powers. The presidency really is different from Congress. The separation of powers is not just taking power, this abstract thing, and dividing it in three. The institutions are different. The Congress really builds out legal frameworks for the future under which our country can then live. The president acts in the present tense now in response to events on behalf of the country. The court reviews past actions to see if they were legal. These are different. They're distinct kinds of uses of power. And I think insisting on those distinctions is very important to this court, so that there are a lot of ways in which we will see the court, on the one hand, affirm some executive actions, on the other hand, turn down others, and seeing the distinction, the difference between the question at issue is going to be very important in the next few years.
And important for Americans to understand those distinctions, which are far too often lost. There's not a lot of room for nuance these days. Either you're for Trump or you're against Trump. And the court's legitimate if they rule in favor, or illegitimate if they don't, and we hear those. So it's important, I think, for this crowd and others to understand those distinctions. I'm also reminded of our mutual friend Jonah Goldberg, who recently said something, I think, to the effect that just because a president can doesn't mean he should, and just because a president shouldn't doesn't mean he can't. And so there's some of those distinctions that are lost in these debates. There's so many different places we could go, and I know we're going to open it up shortly for questions. I was going to dive into the rise of the bureaucratic state, which those decisions kind of push back on a little bit, and how Woodrow Wilson ruined everything in our country, but I won't go there. But I can't, as a governor sitting here, I can't not talk about federalism. Yeah, so can we have that conversation about when we talk about divided government and the different branches of government, we the role of the judiciary, the role of the Congress, the role of the presidency, we forget often that the role of the states was supposed to be a little more maybe preeminent than it is today. You've written at length about kind of the cooperative state and the problem with cooperative federalism and anything. I just want to open it up to both of you on the issue of federalism.
So in the book, I think about federalism first, before Congress, before the other institutions, because I think it is, in a way, the most significant kind of organizing principle of how the Constitution thought about governance. It was also, in some ways, the hardest question confronting the Constitutional Convention. The question was basically, are we creating a single nation where the states are just administrative districts like counties are in a state? Or are we creating a confederation in which the states really govern the people, but there's some things they need to do together, and like the UN, they're represented in Congress. So do the states govern the people, or does the national government govern the people? And the Constitutional Convention answered this question in a way that it answered a lot of the hardest questions it faced, which was by saying yes to an either-or question. And the answer is yes, the states govern the people and the national government governs the people, but they do it with respect to different subjects. And so they're separated into parallel tracks. We often think of federalism as though it were layered, where you have the national government on top of the states, again, in the way that the states kind of sit on top of the counties. But that's not how federalism works. Federalism creates parallel tracks of governance. The feds govern the people directly with respect to commerce, with respect to a small number of other powers they have. The states govern the people directly with respect to everything else. A lot of what's gone wrong in federalism in our time has to do with an intermixing of these powers that were meant to be separated. So that the problem is not exactly that one level of government has more power or less power, it's that they share governance over an important arena of American life. So in welfare, in healthcare, in education, the states and the federal government work together, and it doesn't work. You end up with a situation where the federal government uses national taxpayer money to basically push the states around, and then nobody's really in charge. Look at the Medicaid system. The Medicaid is funded jointly by the federal government and the states, and who's in charge? When something goes wrong, the feds say the states did it, the states say the federal government is responsible, and at the end of the day, no one is responsible. An agenda of federalism reform would have to involve separating these out and disentangling federal and state power. It's not about more or less necessarily. And it may be that we end up thinking that some issues should be governed federally that haven't been before. Maybe healthcare financing should be a national issue, but maybe education should be entirely a state issue. I think, by the way, that's a pretty good trade for most states. Take Medicaid totally off your budget, but give you total control over education and no more federal education spending. That's at least the general way to think about how to improve American federalism, so that they're not in each other's way, and they don't make it impossible for anybody to be responsible for anything. So it's not about just more or less power, but about separate channels of power that govern the people.
Can I add just one thing on this that I think is so important? There's another reason why I think this matters, and I think the polarization today is in large result because we've forgotten this principle. Look, New England is very different from the South, and California is very different from Utah. And when we try to nationalize all of these issues, people feel more restrained, they feel more upset, they feel more anger towards the federal government, when if we allowed more of these regional differences, I think we would have less animosity and problems there. But Judge Griffith,
and just to reinforce
please.
that, and if the decisions are being made at the substantive decisions are being made at the state level, there's a much greater likelihood of having this sort of negotiation and bargaining and compromise than if you do it at a national level. So, but just one thing. So I'm a Washington D.C. guy. Okay, served on the D.C. Circuit. I'm a federal law guy. One of my closest friends is Judge Jeff Sutton on the Sixth Circuit, and he's a big state constitutions guy. And we have this debate, and I keep reminding him, you know, we actually had a war over this issue, and the state's lost. So I'm just kidding.
Fair enough.
I'm just kidding.
We can really argue about that, Tom.
Yeah, I'm just kidding. I just threw that in to be controversial. So
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Rick, we ready to open it up? Let's get some questions from the audience. I'm sure you have several. I could do this all night. So we've got some microphones to take around, and so we'd love you. If you have questions, please raise your hand, and we'll bring a microphone around to you. We have the first one over here.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation. What role do faith communities have in strengthening the habits and virtues to support the Constitution?
This is where I give my Alexis de Tocqueville speech, but I'll refrain, please. Go ahead, both of you.
Well, look, I think the role has to be absolutely central, because ultimately religious communities shape the American character. And what we think of as the work of civil society as a practical matter is very often the work of those faith communities. It's where we're shaped more than anywhere else, or at least where we ought to be. And that means that it has to be part of how we think about shaping and forming American citizens. I think that, you know, I come from a tiny religious minority. I'm Jewish. We're 2% of the population. And it seems to me that especially coming from a religious minority, which, by the way, most Americans do in one way or another, you come to recognize the ways in which this country's approach to religious liberty and to the protection of fundamental rights makes it possible for you to have the kind of community that you think is essential to living a flourishing life and raising your kids. And that means that there has to be an element of gratitude for the American constitutional system in how we think about our country. And all of us, in different ways, in thinking about the role that our religion should play in how we approach other citizens, have to begin from that place. It's not normal in human history for religious diversity to work. It's not normal for it to be possible to live among neighbors who differ about very fundamental questions of religious belief. But it is normal in America. And that means that America is abnormal in a very wonderful way, a very important way that we should not take for granted and should not forget. And that means that if we're invested in the future of our religious communities, we have to also be invested in the future of the American Constitution.
So if I can do some self-promotion for some entities that I'm involved with, I'm on the board of directors of Eboo Patel's Interfaith America. And I'm also at the Wheatley Institute at BYU. And I've seen from that vantage point something really remarkable, and one was involving Governor Cox. I'm going to tell him about last February, the Wheatley Institute put on an event at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. that featured Governor Cox and Governor Wes Moore of Maryland speaking to one another about the Disagree Better initiative. That was followed by a panel, an interfaith panel, talking about the role that religious communities and faith communities can play in overcoming in overcoming toxic polarization. And then we finished with Pete Wehner, evangelical, and Josh Dubois, who was President Obama's faith-based advisor, speaking. It's all done in the setting of the National Cathedral. It was a wonderful event. It was a spectacular event. But here's the story I want to tell you. After the event, 3 foundations came to Paul Edwards and me at the Wheatley Institute, and they said, "We want to fund this, and here's why. Will you do more of these?" And we're doing them now. He said, "You all have stumbled upon what we think is sort of a magic formula here, because you've got faith communities and governors, and that's the thing they want us to do. They're not interested in us doing other sorts of activities. So we're planning a series of activities around the country with Governor Cox's help, of governors who are interested in doing this. But the idea is we're doing them in sacred spaces. We're doing them in synagogues, churches. We haven't got a mosque yet, but hopefully we'll do that. But the idea is to get governors with their political opponents and faith leaders together to address this, because we think there's something magic about it, and the big foundations think there is too. So,
thank you. And if I could, I just, from a practical standpoint, one of the things that concerns me is that as the retreat from faith is happening in our country, that's leaving a void of taking care of each other, and government is expected to fill that void, and government isn't very good at it. We're just not. Government will never have the personal touch that a congregation will have, reaching out to their neighbors and helping their neighbors. And so we come in as a hammer and everything's a nail, and it's far more expensive and doesn't fill people's souls. And so I think it's bad for big government as well. Other questions? We have one right here in the middle, and President Oaks as well.
Hi, I'm Luca, and I'm from Germany, actually. I go to BYU. I've lived in the States for 4 years, and many countries have freedom of speech and freedom of religion. We have Jews and Muslims, lots of Muslims in Germany, and lots of Christians. Our church is not that big in our country, but never felt a position against that. The problem that America has, the radicalization, the glorification of one man that can save the entire nation, that we think is chosen over the other candidates, and his issues and mistakes are not as bad as the one of the other party. We can see that in every country. It's not that Americans don't know what the American character is, and I bet that if we would ask liberals or someone else in a different room, they would define an American character maybe differently. So this disease that people lose trust in the government and everything goes around the world. How do you think we can heal that, we can change that we can come together? In our church, we believe in Zion, in a nation of, you believe that, and in one big nation of common sense of people trusting each other. How can we achieve that in politics?
Well, thank you for the question. There are a number of things I'd say. I think that we Americans tend to think of our country as a very young country. And in some ways it is, in relation to the old nations of old Europe. But as a political matter, our country is actually a very old country. I used to, as a college student in Washington, I used to give tours of the Capitol, and they tell you to start by saying the Capitol building has housed the U.S. Congress since December of 1800. That's actually an amazing fact. There isn't really any other democracy that can say that. There isn't really any other modern nation that can say that. Even the British, who have had institutions of the same name since 1800, no one would say those institutions are the same. We have had the same system of government for a very long time. In that period, most of the nations of Europe have had 4 or 5 different regimes. These institutions we have endured through extraordinary difficulties, divisions, changes, civil war, many very grave problems. And in a sense, what the United States has to offer to the kind of troubles that now trouble every democracy in the world is actually a longer history of dealing with these kinds of challenges than most nations can claim, dealing successfully, ultimately, with these kinds of challenges. And I think what that history teaches us is the importance of balance, the importance of allowing dissenting voices to be heard, but also to be kind of digested into a political order that allows their concerns, their interests to be channeled through a set structure of institutions that allows them to be brought into the process by which we do negotiate and arrive at political ways forward. The problems we face now are not unique to us, but our history of dealing with them is pretty distinct. I think that's useful to us. It may also be useful to other democracies. Most countries in the world are not really ever in the mood to learn from the United States, but there are ways in which our experiences could teach them something. And a lot of that experience is an experience of going through Europe's problems, but in more moderate ways. Because the system we have is above all a system of moderation of extremes. Even now, American politics are really fought within the 40-yard lines compared to Europe's politics today. So I think we shouldn't undervalue what we have to offer, but I also think you're absolutely right to point out that the problems we are dealing with now are part of a large global movement, and it's important for us to see that not all of them can be explained or addressed in purely, simply American terms. There's something larger going on that we have to understand ourselves as part of.
And I just to add quickly to that, you asked, so what can you do? What can you do about this? I don't think this is going to come from a national level with national leaders who are going to. I think it's going to come from gatherings such as this. This may sound simplistic, but I really think it is. So I have learned from Yuval Levin that for me to support and defend the Constitution, I need to be someone who operates this way, who listens to other people, values them, negotiates with them. So if I can get very personal now, I'm a Christian. I practice my Christianity as a Latter-day Saint, and I'm being taught in my faith that my primary obligation as a Christian is to be a peacemaker, that's number one, that when I think of myself and what role I play in any setting I find myself, that's my responsibility. Now, I fall far short of that, but I think if we allow those sorts of institutions to form us in that way, the Constitution forms us as someone who's willing to negotiate and value others. And as a follower of Christ, we're taught that we're to be peacemakers. I really, it sounds simplistic. I think that's what we do in this setting. We model that, and hopefully it'll catch on. So.
And I think that one of the problems today we see is that too many people are allowing politics to become their religion, yes, or at least to allow politics to influence their religion instead of the other way around, and getting back to allowing our religion to moderate our politics. We would be in a much better place if we did that. President Oaks, I think I saw you raise your hand.
I think what the panel has told us about federalism is so valuable. And the basic principle suggested was that the U.S. Constitution gives certain functions to the federal government, other functions to the state government. My question concerns the fact that one of the major controversies of our time occurred when the federal government took over laws on marriage, which from the very beginning have been a function of state law under our system of federalism. And the supremacy clause in the federal Constitution gives the federal government that power, but it hadn't been exercised to that extent so far in the history of our country. I just wonder if you'd comment about that and how it fits into federalism.
It demonstrates, I think, a point Yuval was making, I think we both tried to make. Under our Constitution, the process matters deeply. And I think what we see in this particular instance, people reaching for a goal that they thought was a good goal, and yet, in my view, they bypassed the process to get there. And we can leave for another day the discussion of whether the goal was a worthwhile goal, but I think the way it was reached was in many ways counterproductive. And so I agree with it. The problem with this is, I think most people don't have any sense of this at all. Most people say, "Oh, I want a good result, and whatever it takes to get to that good result, I'm for it." If it takes a president, bursting through the norms and guidelines, that's just, I'm for that. Or if it takes, forgetting the traditional distinction between federal and state to get to the result I'm all for that. And the problem is that sort of, I'm going to call it hypocrisy, that may be a bit strong, but that's bipartisan. It's bipartisan. It just seems the politics of the day are demanding people reach the goal and forget the process. And as Yuval has pointed out, no, the process means everything. And when we overlook the process that should involve the states, well, the states are going to suffer from that. And they're going to become less and less relevant, and then there are going to be all sorts of problems that come from that. Again, I think chief among them is that we reduce the ability of people at a local level to iron out differences. So,
yeah, I very much agree with that, and I would stress one piece of it. I think there's a way that achieving social change by legislative action is just simply more powerful and more legitimate than forcing it by judicial action. I think that that movement was going to win in most places, if not all, gradually, incrementally, legislatively, in ways that would have given people room to accept that result, and to instead press for an immediate national change through the courts is a way to rob themselves of what would have been just a much more broadly legitimate victory. The end result might well have been the same. I don't know, but I think so. But the process matters enormously. The way in which we achieve that kind of change, the fact that legislation is how the American public expresses itself through our Republican system of government, rather than insisting that the question is already pre-answered in the Constitution, which it is not. The Constitution does not answer policy questions for us. It provides us with a mode of answering those questions for ourselves. And to put courts in the place of pretending otherwise, I think ultimately undermines the system and prevents you from showing that you've persuaded the public, and instead puts you in a place of trying to end run the system. I think the courts are there to prevent end runs, not to facilitate them. And too often they've done the opposite.
And maybe even the better example of this is the abortion ruling 40 years ago in Roe v. Wade. If you look at what happened in Europe, it's really interesting, and most Americans are shocked to learn that abortion is only legal for 8 to 12 weeks in most of Europe, and yet that didn't happen in the United States because we were never able to arrive at that consensus going through the process, and it's been so contentious for so many years. I will say it is interesting, and you mentioned this, that whatever can be done by one president, now not speaking to the judiciary, but speaking of federalism, can be undone by the next president. Suddenly, I have a whole bunch of my Democratic colleagues who are governors that are really interested in federalism again. It's amazing how that happened after a Republican won a presidential
Congress,
election.
too. A lot of Democrats have suddenly discovered, it's the first branch, isn't it?
It's amazing how
I
that
guess that's
changes.
good, but let's hope it lasts.
They'll find it some way, one way or another. We have a question over here, please.
Good evening. Thank you for the insightful comments. And I have a question for Mr. Levin and Justice Griffith. Mr. Levin, you said that Congress has capitulated. From an educational perspective, can you cite a period where you started to see that capitulation? And Justice Griffith, Dr. Richard Haas, the former CEO and president of the Council of Foreign Relations, has said for years we need to start teaching civics again. Does that fall under the state, and also for Governor Cox, or the federal, as it's so fundamental that we teach English and mathematics in school? Should we start teaching again civics? And if so, at what period do we start bringing in civics into the educational system?
Well, to the first question, I would say I think the modern era of congressional dereliction is really a 21st century phenomenon. It begins in some ways as early as the 1980s. You see it a bit in the 90s, but it's particularly evident in this century where we've had very close elections, both for president and for Congress. And Congress has tended to understand itself as defined by whoever is president, whether in opposition to that person or in support of his agenda. I'll give you a very quick example. I worked for President Bush, George W. Bush. I was a White House staffer, and in 2006, there was legislation moving through Congress that would have reversed a policy of his that had to do with stem cell research funding. It fell in my bailiwick, and the president had said he would veto that bill if it passed. It was going to pass, so we had a quick meeting with him, 15 minutes in the Oval Office, just to say, are you going to veto it? Are you sure? And he said, yeah, I've said this 1,000 times, I'm going to veto it. Easiest meeting ever. We get up to leave, and as we're leaving, the president says, so a veto, what actually do we do? I did this as governor in Texas, but do I sign something? Is there a public... This is 2006. It's in his second term. He had been president for 5 years. But it was, in fact, his first veto. The Congress had been in Republican hands for the first 6 years of his presidency, and they never sent him any legislation he didn't approve of. He never vetoed anything, because that Republican Congress understood itself as having a job that involved facilitating the president's agenda, rather than understanding itself as advancing a distinct legislative agenda that would be the result of bipartisan bargaining. I think that tendency has only been exacerbated since those years, and that increasingly Congress has come to see itself as a secondary actor in our system. This was less common, not unheard of, but less common before the 21st century. We've seen periods like this before, in some respects, and we've seen periods where Congress has reasserted itself, though I have to say that has mostly happened in times of long-term divided government. The 1970s is an example where Richard Nixon was elected by huge majorities, and at the same time, Democrats had congressional majorities, and there were epic battles between Congress and the president in that period. I think we could use some epic battles, regardless of who's president and who has the congressional majority. It would be good for the system.
So regarding civics education, we probably have some educators here who would be better able to address that than I would, but you directed the question to me, so I get the answer. As to whether it's federal or state, that's my personal preferences. I favor state controlling education rather than the national government, but whoever does it, and I would prefer the states. I know you put your finger on a critical issue. Civics education is just sorely lacking in our country, and I see that. So I teach a class at Harvard Law School. I teach another class at Stanford Law School. These are some of our very best and brightest, and they're earnest, and they care, and they don't get a lot of this basic stuff because they haven't been taught it. And so I'm not going to claim that my teaching at Harvard Law School or Stanford is remedial teaching on the Constitution, but maybe it is. Maybe it is. So yeah, it's sorely lacking. Now, there's good news out there, right? I mean, Justice O'Connor, before she died, her major emphasis, well, she had two. One was to get rid of state election of judges. That didn't go so well. But the other, she created this outfit called iCivics, which is very active in public schools around the country with some very creative ideas about how to teach civics education. So, but you're right. I mean, there's a fundamental lack of understanding about the concepts that Yuval has been talking about that needs to be addressed. So.
I would only add that we have 3 civics bills in the legislature this year here in Utah, and we're very hopeful to get all 3 of those passed, including one that I'm very excited about. It'll be a pilot program at Utah State University that would put a Western thought back into general education at our university, and the hope is to take that to all of our state universities and colleges, where we're teaching Aristotle and Cicero and Shakespeare and the founders and their vision for our country, something that most of us in this room probably got when we were in college. Obviously, we need more of this in high school and middle school and elementary school, and we have bills on that as well. But our universities, I think, have been sorely lacking when it comes to that type of Western thought in our general education, and I'm very excited to start to offer that again. We will turn it back to our esteemed leader.
Thank you, Governor. You know, there's a bit of a sacred feel to this conversation, but despite that, I think a round of applause is in order for this group. I would like to offer my personal thanks to all 3 of you. Again, I know your schedules, and I know you were here at great sacrifice, so thank you. I just want to say to everyone, thank you for being here. You may have learned some new definitions of what defending the Constitution looks like as you've listened to this conversation. Our hope is this, that you'll take what you've heard, what you felt, and what you are going to learn as you read Yuval's book, and make it a subject of conversation in your homes and in your communities. I know we're never supposed to talk about politics and religion among friends. I think we've taken that too far because we no longer talk about it, we fight about it. There's room for conversation. Sutherland has been defending these principles for coming on 30 years now. So as a think tank, we're so resonant with these ideas and so eager to reintroduce them into the policy process. And you being here tonight is part of that. It's part of our mission. I'd be remiss if I didn't say a word about think tanks. The great thinking that you've heard from Yuval Levin tonight came about in large part because of his association with American Enterprise Institute, a think tank, a national think tank. This convening, an effort of Sutherland Institute, a state-based think tank. As you consider your support of political candidates and think tanks, I just want to underline the fact that part of your judgment should be based on this. Think tanks should generate their product, which is thought leadership, based on constitutional principles, not on partisan politics. It's an important distinction because there's plenty of partisan rancor out there. What we're short on is constitutionally based thought that we can discuss, consider, debate, and act on. So we thank you, by participating tonight, we thank you for becoming part of that process. And we again thank our panel, and we would encourage all of you to incorporate this into your homes and families. You leave here qualified to be the one to stop a conversation that is completely critical of our nation and of freedom and say, the problem is not the Constitution, the problem may be us, and share those principles with other people. If you'd like more information about what we're working on in Utah, go to sutherlandinstitute.org. Think tanks exist with the support of the public. We would love to earn your support and become partners with you in furthering this message. Thank you again. Travel safely, and good night.